In the quiet, postcard-perfect town of Salem, Massachusetts, Dr. Richard Hale was known as the kind of physician you could trust with your life. He had practiced medicine for over 25 years, earning the respect of his patients and the unspoken envy of his peers. His clinic, housed in a renovated 19th century brick building, was a beacon of health in a town whose history was steeped in death, fear, and whispers. But Salem had always been more than its history. Beneath the cobblestone streets and quaint tourist shops, there were stories, real stories that locals never told visitors. Stories about the places where the ground seemed to hum beneath your feet, where shadows didn't quite match their owners, and where whispers in the dark weren't carried by the wind. Richard never believed in any of it. He trusted anatomy, diagnosis, and lab results, not ghost tales. That changed the day a patient came to him with symptoms he couldn't explain. Symptoms that seemed less like a disease and more like a curse. By the time Richard realized the truth, it was already too late. The thing he had discovered wasn't just an illness. It was alive, and it had already chosen him. It began on a gray Tuesday morning in late October. Outside, mist hung low over the harbor, wrapping the old fishing boats in pale gauze. Inside the clinic, the scent of disinfectant clung to the air like invisible frost. Dr. Richard Hale sipped black coffee in his office, glancing at the patient's schedule. Most cases were routine seasonal flu checkups, prescription refills, except for the last name on the list. Evelyn Moore, age 27, symptoms: fever, dizziness, persistent nosebleeds. Duration: 1 week, notes: none. When Evelyn stepped into his office, Richard noticed the tremor in her hands. Her skin had the waxy pallor of a porcelain doll left in the cold too long, and the whites of her eyes were streaked with dark red veins. "How long has this been happening?" Richard asked as he examined her. 7 days, she said softly, "but it's getting worse. It's not just the bleeding. I can hear things." "Hear what?" She hesitated, glancing toward the far wall as if someone stood there. "They whisper at night in my apartment on Derby Street, but sometimes I think they're inside me." Richard's pen paused mid-note. This wasn't typical fever delirium. Her vitals didn't match any infection he knew. He ordered a blood test immediately, but when the needle pierced her skin, something unexpected happened. Her blood was too dark, almost black, and it was thick, so thick the syringe plunger resisted his push. Richard locked eyes with her. "Have you been exposed to any chemicals? Radiation? Anything unusual?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, only the wall." He frowned. "The wall in my apartment. There's something behind it. It moves." Before he could ask more, she winced, pressing a hand to her abdomen. A faint tapping sound echoed in the room, too faint for the nurse to notice, but Richard heard it clearly. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, except it wasn't hers. Dr. Jonathan Hale sat at his kitchen table in the soft glow of a single hanging light, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. Outside, the late autumn wind howled against the windows of his modest colonial-style home. He was reading through an old patient file, not from Boston, but from a small Massachusetts town he'd never been to before. The name stamped on the folder was Gray Brook. The file had arrived the previous night in a plain brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter typed on yellowed stationery. "Dr. Hale, we have heard of your work, your discretion, your ability to see what others cannot. Gray Brook has a problem, and only you can help. A matter of life and death. Please come immediately." The Gray Brook Clinic board. There was no phone number, only a hand-drawn map with a red X marking the clinic's location. Jonathan frowned, tapping the edge of the file. Gray Brook. He vaguely recalled hearing the name during his medical school years, whispered in the same way one might speak about a ghost story or rural town. Old Puritan roots, with a history of strange disappearances and hushed medical scandals in the early 1900s, the kind of place where gossip aged like wine, becoming darker over decades. Jonathan wasn't easily rattled. He'd spent years working as a trauma surgeon in Boston's busiest hospital, had seen things that still woke him in the middle of the night, but this was different. This felt personal. He didn't know why, but the tone of the letter carried a strange weight, as if whoever wrote it already knew he would say yes. For the rest of the day, Jonathan tried to ignore the envelope. He saw patients, reviewed lab results, signed off on surgeries. But by evening, he found himself studying the map again, tracing the thin lines of winding country roads that led into the heart of Grey Brook. He noticed something odd. There were no highway exits leading directly there. The roads seemed to loop and twist like veins in an old anatomy drawing, as if the town itself resisted being found. He made a decision just before midnight. He packed a small leather doctor's bag with basic medical tools: stethoscope, thermometer, syringes, scalpels. Then he added something unusual, an antique silver medical kit his father had left him, its instruments gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He wasn't sure why he brought it, maybe instinct. The drive took hours, the interstate giving way to narrower and narrower roads. The moon was a pale smear behind clouds, and the forest pressed in on both sides, dense and black. His headlights caught glimpses of gnarled branches, stone walls, and the occasional weather-beaten house set far back from the road. As he approached the final turn marked on the map, Jonathan slowed. The trees parted, revealing a sign hand-carved. The paint chipped away. "Welcome to Grey Brook, established 1692. Beneath it, a smaller, newer sign read in red block letters. Medical personnel only beyond this point. Jonathan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Towns didn't usually restrict themselves like that unless something was very, very wrong in the distance. Under the weak orange glow of old street lamps, the outline of the Grey Brook Clinic came into view, a towering brick structure that looked more like an asylum than a modern medical center. Its tall windows reflected no light, and the air around it seemed unnaturally still. Jonathan felt the first cold thread of unease coil in his stomach. He told himself it was just exhaustion from the drive. But deep down, he knew something in Grey Brook had been waiting for him, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Dr. Richard Hale had spent most of his adult life in bustling hospital corridors, where the constant hum of activity never allowed silence to linger for long. But in Greywick, Massachusetts, silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it felt deliberate, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The first morning after his arrival, Richard took a slow walk through Main Street. It was early October, the kind of crisp autumn morning when the air carries the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. Yet, instead of the warmth he expected from a small New England town, he felt watched. Not openly, no one stared directly, but in that sidelong way where people seemed to weigh the cost of acknowledging him. Shops were open, but few customers lingered. The baker, a short woman with pale eyes, handed him a bag of scones without a smile, her hands trembling slightly when they brushed his outside. An old man swept the front of his hardware store but froze mid-motion as Richard passed, his broom hanging in the air. The most unsettling thing was the lack of children. His mind replaying the faces he'd seen that day, every one of them carrying the same unspoken fear. Somewhere in this quiet town, he thought, there was a wound no one wanted to talk about. Richard Halloway had convinced himself that the strange episode with Eleanor White was a product of stress and overwork. After all, in 30 years of practicing medicine, he had seen plenty of anomalies, cases that defied easy explanation. But none had ever followed him into his dreams. Still, there was a lingering unease. It clung to him like the coastal fog outside. Whispering in the spaces between his thoughts, he told himself he wouldn't dwell on it. Until the day a new patient's name appeared on his schedule, Eleanor White follow-up, it made no sense. He had written her as deceased. Her case file had been closed. When the door to his consultation room creaked open, he half expected a clerical error, but the woman who stepped inside was unmistakable. Her hair was pinned exactly as before, her cardigan the same pale lavender. Her skin was not corpse pale now, but carried a faint, unnatural glow "Good morning, Doctor," she said softly, lowering herself into the chair. Richard's pulse spiked. "Mrs. White." He stopped. He didn't know what to say without sounding insane. She smiled faintly, as if amused by his discomfort. "I told you I'd be back. There's something I need to show you." The way she said it sent a ripple of cold through him. He glanced toward the hallway, considering calling for a nurse, but something in her gaze held him frozen. She slid a thin manila envelope across the desk. "Inside, you'll find the truth about my death." Richard hesitated, but his curiosity overcame his caution. He opened the envelope and found a series of grainy black and white photographs, not of her, but of a laboratory. Stainless steel tables, surgical instruments, medical refrigerators labeled with numbers, not names. And in the background of one image, a man in surgical scrubs who looked exactly like him. His breath caught. The date scrawled on the back read: November 17th, 1999, a full 20 years earlier. "That's not possible," he muttered, setting the photo down. "It is," Eleanor whispered, leaning forward. "And they'll come for you when they realize I've spoken to you. You've been part of this longer than you remember, Doctor." Before he could respond, she stood and left the room without another word. Richard stared at the empty doorway, the envelope still in his hand, the smell of salt and antiseptic mingling in the air. His rational mind screamed for an explanation. But another part of him, the part buried under decades of clinical certainty, knew he had just stepped into something far bigger and far more dangerous than he could comprehend. The following night, Dr. Jonathan Hale returned home late from the hospital. The streets of Hawthorne Hollow were quiet, a thick fog rolling in from the harbor and swallowing the lamps one by one. He parked in his driveway, noticing a strange shadow stretching across his porch still to be from a tree. He stepped out of the car slowly, gripping his leather bag as though it might shield him. The shadow shifted, and there, at the far corner of the porch, stood a man. His clothes were old-fashioned, a long, dark coat and a brim had pulled low over his face. He didn't speak, just stood there as if waiting for something. "Can I help you?" Jonathan called, his voice carrying through the damp air. The man didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly, as though studying Jonathan in the dim light. Then he took a step forward, and the sound of his shoes on the wood echoed unnaturally, almost hollow. Jonathan's hand instinctively moved toward his pocket, where his phone rested, but before he could pull it out, the man's voice finally came low, gravelly, and oddly deliberate. "You have something of mine, Doctor." Jonathan froze. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." The man shook his head slowly. "No mistake, it's in your hospital, locked away where it shouldn't be." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "What are you talking about?" The man took another step closer, his features still hidden in the shadows. "You know, you've seen it, the body that shouldn't be alive. The one they hide in the sub-basement." Jonathan's mouth went dry. No one outside the hospital staff should have known about that about her. Before Jonathan could respond, the man turned abruptly and stepped off the porch into the fog. In seconds, he was gone, as if the mist had swallowed him whole. Jonathan stood there for a long time, the chill settling deep into his bones. The hospital had secrets, yes, but now it seemed those secrets had a way of finding him at home when he finally went inside. There was an envelope on his kitchen table. He didn't remember leaving it there. His name was written in neat, old-fashioned script. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph, grainy, dark, and unmistakable. It was of the hospital's sub-basement door, and the faint outline of a woman standing just behind it. The following week, Doctor Jonathan Hale could no longer resist his growing curiosity about the locked wing at the far end of St. Mary's Medical Center. It was a part of the hospital rarely mentioned, and when it was, it came in clipped, hushed tones. Some staff claimed it was being renovated, but Jonathan had already noticed the faint glow of lights behind its frosted windows at night. Renovations didn't require round-the-clock illumination or the muted shadows moving inside. One evening, After his last patient had been discharged, Jonathan made his way down the service hallway. The linoleum tiles here were older, cracked, and gave off a faint smell of antiseptic and damp plaster. A thick layer of dust coated the handrails, suggesting the place hadn't been touched in years, yet the air felt oddly worn, as if recently disturbed. The heavy steel door at the end bore a faded sign, "Wardy authorized personnel only." The lock was electronic, but when Jonathan swiped his hospital badge, it gave a sharp beep, and the door clicked open. He froze had he just been granted access by mistake, still, his heart pounding. He pushed it open. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered. The ward was eerily silent, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but full, as if it was listening. The patient rooms here were dim, their doors half open. Jonathan stepped closer to one and peered inside. The bed was occupied by a figure lying perfectly still under thin sheets. At first, he thought the patient was sleeping, but when he moved closer, he noticed the breathing was wrong. It was too slow, too mechanical. Jonathan checked the monitor, heart rate, 20 BPM, respiratory rate, for breaths per minute. That wasn't humanly possible. He leaned in and noticed the patient's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, pupils dilated. No sedation, no oxygen, no for lines, just a faint hum coming from somewhere in the walls. As he stepped back, a sound echoed down the corridor, a slow shuffle of footsteps, deliberate and heavy. Jonathan's chest tightened. He turned toward the noise and saw a figure in a full-body sterile suit, face hidden behind a reflective visor, walking toward him. Dr. Hale. The figure's voice was muffled but firm. "You shouldn't be here." Jonathan's mouth went dry. "What's wrong with that patient?" The figure paused. Even behind the visor, Jonathan could feel the weight of the stare. "They're stable," the person said after a beat, then took a step closer. "And you will forget what you've seen here." Something in the tone wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, but Jonathan knew he wouldn't forget. He couldn't. The image of those unnatural breaths, the lifeless eyes, and the faint mechanical hum would haunt him, and somewhere deep down, he understood. Whatever was happening here wasn't just medical, it was something else entirely. As he left Wardy, the electronic lock clicked shut behind him, sealing the silence inside. But Jonathan was certain he could still hear that steady, inhuman breathing echoing in his ears. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Dr. Gregory Harlow walked into his office at Stone Mount General Hospital, coffee in hand, the cool autumn air still clinging to his coat. He expected a standard day checkups, consultations, perhaps a few minor emergencies. But instead, he found an unmarked manila file lying neatly on his desk. It wasn't in the hospital's standard format, no name on the front. Just a date, October 14th, 2023, and the words admit immediately scrawled in sharp, urgent handwriting. He frowned. "Patricia." The vitals flatlined. Harlow tried CPR, defibrillation, nothing worked. Ward was dead, and yet 5 minutes later, while Harlow was writing the death note, Ward's chest rose again. The monitor beeped. The man opened his eyes, looked straight at Harlow, and smiled. By the time the clock struck midnight, Dr. Whitford found himself standing before the rusted steel doors of Ward C, a section of the hospital that had been sealed for over 30 years. His hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from the undeniable sense that what lay beyond those doors would not only explain the anomalies in his patients, but also confirm every unspoken suspicion about Brookhaven's dark history. The electronic lock's display flickered weakly as he inserted a stolen access card. He had acquired it earlier that day by pretending to inspect the storage area in the basement. The security measures were supposed to be state-of-the-art, yet the card slid through with almost no resistance, as if the building itself wanted him to enter. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the corridor like a dying animal. A wave of sterile, icy air brushed past him, carrying the faint odor of antiseptic, and something far less clinical, something metallic, something like old blood. Inside, Ward C was frozen in time. Dust hung in the air like ghostly fog, swirling in the narrow beams of his flashlight. Every bed was perfectly aligned, sheets still tucked in military precision. Yet the pillows bore deep, sunken impressions, as if the patients had only recently risen. On the far wall, Whitford noticed a large glass observation window. Behind it stood rows of metal examination chairs bolted to the floor, each one equipped with leather restraints. The straps were worn and frayed, stained dark in places where the leather had absorbed something it should never have. Above each chair hung an intricate web of wiring, sensors, and needles. Whitford stepped closer. His breath fogging the glass, he noticed labels affixed to each chair's base: cognitive disruption protocol, phased neuroreconfiguration, memory extraction. The words didn't sound like standard medical terms, they sounded like weapons. A sudden metallic click behind him made his heart lurch. The steel doors had closed. Slowly, he turned and saw the keypad flashing locked. The card in his hand was now useless. From somewhere within the ward, a soft, rhythmic beeping began. It came from an old, wall-mounted monitor that shouldn't have had any power. Its screen glowed green, and a distorted voice, synthetic yet oddly human, whispered through the static. "Dr. Whitford, we've been waiting for you." The sound wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the restraints themselves. The leather strap shivered, curling as if alive. Whitford stepped back, but the floor beneath him seemed to tilt, forcing him toward the glass observation window. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he swore he saw a shadow seated in one of the chairs, its head covered by a metal crown of wires, its body twitching in sharp, unnatural spasms. Then the beeping grew faster, louder. The lights overhead snapped on all at once, revealing something even worse. Every single bed in the ward was now occupied, and all the patients were staring directly at him. The elevator shuddered to a halt deep beneath the hospital's lowest recorded floor, a place where no blueprint had ever acknowledged its existence. Dr. Marcus Ellery stepped out into a dimly lit corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic, like blood left to dry on stainless steel. The walls were painted a sterile white, but the paint peeled in long, curling strips, revealing older layers beneath. He could hear the hum of machinery, steady, mechanical, and somehow alive. He walked forward cautiously, his footsteps echoing unnaturally, as if the hallway was absorbing the sound. On either side, heavy metal doors were sealed with complex locking mechanisms. Most bore small, reinforced windows, though some had been welded completely shut. Inside those with windows, shadowy shapes twitched on gurneys, their movements slow but purposeful, like the stirring of sedated animals. Marcus hesitated at one door, pressing his face close to the glass. The thing inside was once human. Its chest rose and fell irregularly, tubes protruding from its throat and arms. Its skin was unnaturally pale, stretched tight over sharp bones, and its eyes, when they opened, were clouded yet fixed directly on him. It tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet gurgle that made his stomach turn. As he moved deeper into the corridor, the hum grew louder. It was no longer just machinery. There was a rhythm to it, almost like a heartbeat. Turning a corner, he found a massive set of double doors. Above them, an illuminated sign read, "Project Vivid Pulse, authorized personnel only." His keycard shouldn't have worked, but when he swiped it, the doors clicked open instantly, almost as if the system had been expecting him. Inside, the room was cavernous, dominated by a series of glass tanks filled with a viscous, pale blue liquid. Suspended within each tank were bodies, some human, some not quite. Tubes fed into their veins, while electrodes connected to their temples sparked occasionally. Many of them were missing patches of skin, exposing muscle and bone beneath, yet their faces displayed faint, almost peaceful expressions, as if they were dreaming. In the center of the room stood a massive cylindrical chamber with its own glowing tank, larger than the rest. Inside floated a man who looked disturbingly familiar. Marcus stepped closer and froze. The face was his own, but younger, healthier, eyes closed as though sleeping. His chest rose and fell, perfectly synchronized with the hum that now filled the air entirely. The shock sent a wave of cold through Marcus's body. He reached out, placing a trembling hand against the glass, and felt a faint pulse from within, not just of the man in the tank, but something deeper, something alive in the walls, in the floor, in the very air. Then a voice spoke from behind him. Low and calm. I told you, it said, you're not here to treat patients, Dr. Ellery. You are one. Marcus turned slowly. Standing there was Dr. Hawthorne, the head of the hospital, but his face seemed stretched, subtly wrong, his pupils too large, his smile too perfect, and in that instant, Marcus realized that the hum he had been hearing wasn't just machinery or a heartbeat. It was calling him. Dr. Jonathan Hale stood over the stainless steel table in the hospital morgue, his gloved hands poised above the body of Arthur Green, the latest patient to die under mysterious circumstances in Harrow's End. The overhead light cast a cold, unforgiving glow over the pale, waxy skin, making the man look more like a mannequin than a person who had once walked the streets of their quiet Massachusetts town. Arthur had been admitted 3 nights ago with severe respiratory distress, fever, and erratic muscle tremors. Within 48 hours, his organs began shutting down, yet the tests showed no trace of infection, no toxins, no underlying disease. Officially, the death was being attributed to an identified systemic failure. Unofficially, Jonathan knew something was hiding in the tissue, something no textbook could explain. He took the first incision, a clean Y-cut across the chest. Something in Harrow's End wasn't just killing people, it was erasing the evidence. The winter sun barely touched the streets of Camden Hollow that morning, and a brittle frost still clung to the edges of windows when Dr. Nathaniel Pierce arrived at St. Augustine Medical Center. He hadn't slept much, his mind still replaying the incident in the isolation wing, the strange reaction from patient 77, the flash of something inhuman behind the man's eyes. As Nathaniel walked through the hospital's main corridor, he noticed 2 security guards stationed outside the intensive care unit. They weren't the usual staff. Their uniforms had no hospital insignia, only plain black with earpieces and holstered tasers. Their presence confirmed what Nathaniel had feared. Patient 77 was no ordinary case, and someone very powerful wanted him contained. Nathaniel approached the nurse's desk and leaned in toward Emma, the head nurse. Who authorized the extra security? He asked quietly. Emma shook her head, glancing nervously at the guards. It came from above, far above. They didn't tell us. They just said the patient is under a special protocol. Nathaniel had worked in hospitals long enough to know what that meant: government involvement, classified files, and the kind of medical ethics that got twisted to serve hidden agendas. Later, while reviewing charts in his office, Nathaniel was interrupted by a voice from the doorway. Dr. Pierce. He looked up to see a tall, thin man in a gray suit. His face was expressionless, his eyes calculating. My name is Agent Colburn. I'm with the Federal Department of Biomedical Security. We need to discuss patient 77. Nathaniel gestured for him to sit, but Colburn remained standing. The patient is infected with a highly experimental biomaterial, something not meant for public knowledge. It is crucial that no one outside this hospital learns of his condition. You will follow all instructions given to you, and you will not share any findings with unauthorized personnel. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. I have an ethical obligation to my patients. Colburn cut him off. Doctor, you have an obligation to your country. If the nature of this infection becomes public, it will cause widespread panic, and perhaps worse. After Colburn left, Nathaniel sat in silence. He knew there was more to the story, the symptoms, the strange physiological readings. They didn't match any virus or disease he had ever studied. And the patient's blood tests contained anomalies, microscopic structures that almost looked engineered. That night, unable to resist his instincts, Nathaniel returned to the lab after hours. Why would they fear the patient waking up fully? What exactly would he remember? The next morning, when Nathaniel visited the isolation wing, patient 77's eyes were open, and her medical records were non-existent. Whitmore's first instinct was suspicion, but he followed protocol. She claimed to be suffering from severe fatigue and shortness of breath. Basic tests showed almost nothing abnormal except one glaring impossibility. Her blood type was of negative, a rare type, but the cell structure under microscopic examination looked wrong. When Whitmore compared her results to the encrypted research files of the Revival Serum Project, his breath caught in his throat. The anomalies in her cells matched exactly those of the patients they had saved with the serum months ago. The problem was, according to the database, Grace Keller's name was never in the program. During the night, Whitmore reviewed footage from the entrance. Grace appeared to walk into the hospital alone, but frame by frame, her movement was off, not jerky, not mechanical, but too smooth. Like each step was an edited splice of reality. The next morning, she was gone. Her bed was empty, her fur still attached to the pole, monitor wires dangling. Security footage from that night showed nothing, no sign of her leaving the building. Then, later that day, Whitmore received an unmarked envelope slipped under his office door. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Grace standing at the edge of Ashford's Harbor in broad daylight, except her skin looked gray, her eyes almost entirely black. And in the reflection on the water, she wasn't alone. There was another figure beside her, a tall, thin man in a dark coat. A man Whitmore recognized instantly from a memory he had tried to bury. It was the first patient he had ever revived with the serum. The one who had died again weeks later and was buried under a false name, and in the photo, the man was smiling. The night bled into the early hours of the morning, the air outside so still it felt suffocating. David sat in the kitchen, staring at the basement door. It had been shut since the last time he heard the voice, his mother's voice calling from below, but the lock was trembling again, the wood creaking as if something leaned against it from the other side. His knuckles were white on the handle of the knife he gripped. He knew by now that this wasn't about the house being haunted, it was about the house itself wanting him. A low thump echoed from the cellar, followed by a scraping sound. The basement floorboards groaned under weight that moved slowly, deliberately, as if dragging something across the concrete. Then came the whisper. Not his mother's this time, not any voice he knew. "You're almost ready." David's stomach turned cold. He stood, every part of him screaming to run, but he couldn't. The voice was like a hook lodged in his mind, pulling him forward. He reached for the lock, fingers trembling. The metal was icy to the touch. As soon as the latch clicked open, the door swung inward without his help. A smell rolled out, wet soil, mold, and something coppery and sharp. The basement was pitch black. Not the kind of darkness you could get used to. This was thick, like liquid, swallowing the light before it could reach the bottom of the stairs. David descended slowly, his footfalls muffled. Halfway down, he realized the steps were softer than they should be, and when he glanced down, the wood looked wet. At the bottom, something moved. He couldn't see it clearly, but he could hear it breathing a wet, rattling inhale, followed by a long, deliberate exhale. "You took too long," the voice hissed from the shadows. David felt something cold and smooth brush against his arm. Reflexively, he stepped back, but instead of touching a wall, his hand sank into something warm and soft, like skin stretched over bone. And then it smiled. He didn't see teeth, he felt them. From above, the basement door slammed shut. The light from the bulb at the top of the stairs flickered, and for the briefest moment, David saw it tall, impossibly thin, its skin sagging in folds, eyes like pits of tar. It had been waiting for him, and now there was no way back up. The first steps into the woods behind the abandoned farmhouse felt like crossing an unseen threshold. The air grew denser, charged with a subtle electric tension that prickled along my skin. Massachusetts was full of forests, but these trees were different. Their trunks were twisted in unnatural spirals, their bark etched with strange grooves that almost resembled letters, as though the forest itself had been trying to write something in a language long forgotten. I kept my flashlight steady, but the beam was swallowed by the shadows before it could reach very far. Branches creaked overhead, not from the wind, for there was none, but from something else moving among them. Every so often, a whisper threaded its way through the trees. It wasn't the rustling of leaves, it was words. At first, they were too soft to understand, a hushed chorus coming from all directions at once. My heart hammered faster, and I slowed my steps, straining to catch even a single clear phrase. Then it came, just behind my right ear, so close it could have been a breath. "Don't turn around," I froze. My every instinct screamed at me to whip the flashlight toward the voice, but my feet remained rooted. The forest was utterly silent now, as if holding its breath, waiting for me to make the wrong move. My mind began to spiral with the realization that I hadn't come here alone. Not really. The woods felt occupied, and whatever lived here was intelligent enough to speak. The whisper came again, this time in front of me. "Keep going, but not too far." My mouth went dry. I forced myself forward, one step, then another, following a barely visible trail of trampled leaves. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to rearrange itself. Trees I passed would shift subtly when I looked away. Paths would vanish when I glanced back. Then, a shape appeared between the trunks ahead, a tall figure, pale against the dark. Its limbs were impossibly long, each finger tapering to a point that gleamed faintly in my flashlight's edge. It didn't move, but I had the unshakable feeling it was watching me, even though its face was shrouded in shadow. Behind me, the whispers swelled, overlapping, urging, warning, mocking. My chest tightened. I understood now. The forest didn't just contain this thing, it was this thing. Every tree, every shadow, every voice, they were parts of the same ancient, hungry entity. And I had wandered too deep. The corridors no longer felt like part of a hospital. They pulsed and shifted like living flesh, the walls breathing in and out with an unnatural rhythm. The dim overhead lights flickered, revealing veins and tendrils snaking along the plaster, their tips twitching as if sensing my presence. The air was heavy with the smell of rust and something far more organic, like decaying meat buried in wet soil. I pressed forward, every step sinking slightly into the floor, the squelch under my boots making my stomach twist. My flashlight beam caught fleeting images, faces pressed into the walls, mouths moving in silent screams, eyes darting toward me before vanishing into the flesh. I could feel them watching, judging whether I would join them. The stairwell to the basement, the real basement, was ahead. The door was warped, swollen with moisture, its metal handle slick with an unidentifiable slime. My hand trembled as I reached for it, but when my fingers closed around the handle, it was warm, too warm, as though it had just been touched by something alive. The moment the door creaked open, a wave of cold, fetid air washed over me, carrying the faint sound of whispers that grew clearer with each step I took downward. They weren't random mutterings anymore. They formed my name, over and over, until it felt like the walls themselves were chanting for me to descend. The staircase spiraled deeper than it should have, far beyond the physical limits of the building. My legs burned, my lungs strained, but the oppressive pull from below wouldn't let me stop. My flashlight flickered again, revealing glimpses of a massive chamber below, lit by a sickly green glow. Something writhed in the shadows, enormous and formless, its bulk shifting as though it was made of countless bodies fused together. And then I saw at the source of the whispers. A figure stood in the center of the chamber, tall and impossibly thin, draped in what looked like the remnants of a nurse's uniform. Its face was hidden beneath a veil of dark, wet hair, but its hands, they were skeletal, ending in long, needle-like fingers. Around its neck hung an old brass hospital key, the same one from the files I had found earlier when it turned toward me. The storm outside had grown into a deafening roar, but inside the Ashford estate, The air felt even heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My flashlight flickered for the last time before going completely dark, forcing me to move by the dim, ghostly glow of the lightning outside. The basement door stood ajar, creaking ever so slightly with each gust of wind rattling the old frame. I could hear them shuffling footsteps, raspy breaths, and the faint scratching along the floorboards. They were close. Too close, ended, I muttered to myself, gripping the rusted iron poker I had found earlier. My plan was simple, though I had no guarantee it would work. Lure the spirits to the heart of the house, the grand foyer, where I had prepared a circle of salt, old talismans, and the journal pages that revealed their curse. As I stepped into the center of the room, they appeared three figures, pale and waterlogged, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. One was the old woman I had seen in the mirror weeks ago. Another, a young boy with a twisted neck. The third was the man from the attic window, his mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide for a human face. "You shouldn't have stayed," the old woman rasped, her voice layered with dozens of whispers. The air grew thick, the walls seemed to close in, and my breath turned to white vapor. My heart slammed in my chest, but I didn't move. Instead, I recited the words from the journal, an exorcism not of faith, but of ancient binding. The house shook, plaster raining from the ceiling, and the floor beneath me cracked as if something deep below was clawing its way up. The spirits screamed not in pain, but in fury as the circle of salt began to glow faintly. The light built until it was blinding, forcing me to close my eyes. And then silence. When I opened them again, the foyer was empty. The cold was gone, only the faint smell of damp earth lingered. Outside, the storm had passed. I stumbled toward the front door, expecting it to be locked as always, but it swung open freely. The morning sun spilled in, warm and impossibly bright. I stepped outside and didn't look back. The Ashford estate was quiet, too quiet. I left Massachusetts the very next day. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not the police, not the locals, not even the friends who had begged me not to buy the place in the first place. I sold the property for almost nothing, not caring about the loss. Sometimes I think about that night, about the way the spirits vanished in that blinding light. I tell myself they're gone, that the curse is broken, but every so often, late at night, I dream of the old woman. She's standing in the grand foyer, just where I left her, smiling faintly, and behind her, the man from the attic window is still there, waiting. And when I wake up, there's always the same thing on my bedroom floor, a faint trail of damp footprints leading toward my bed. I haven't slept well in months.